And here we go. Good evening. It is good to see all of you. Welcome to being with us. Let the computer get warmed up there. There we go. We are in our second week of our 2021 series of Valencia at Westminster. I'm so glad that you're here with us. Just kind of a housekeeping work. We're in the middle of a series that is in response to requests that some participants made. And I want to reiterate that whether you're watching now or you're watching on recording, if you have a topic of interest to yourself that you would like to ask, I would love to put that on the list. I have a whole series of things that we've been studying and talking about, and we may in the future years loop back to some of those because it's always interesting to take another run at it. I also this year have already talked to 5 or 6 of my colleagues who are going to join us. So it's really kind of exciting for them to be joining. We've got my friend Brian Macon is going to do a couple series talks to us on math, and my friend Professor Borglum who's going to do a talk to us about literature from the late 19th century. So I'm really excited about having these other topics presented and these other professors coming in and joining us. So what we are looking at though is this the study on antiquity. So we're all the way back at basically the beginning. And if you remember what we talked about last time, we were trying to address what was asked by a couple of different people, basically, whether or not, there was, could you understand the human species? What's the beginning? And of course, the anthropologists will tell us that we go much further back, and we will allow them that and agree that there is certainly evidence that we can hold to. But what we saw last time was that for most historians, the Bronze Age, or the time in which our first major civilizations developed writing, provide us the foundation of where we start when we say antiquity. So that's why you'll often hear me say that there's been, 5,500, 6,000 years, because roughly in the mid 3000 BC time, do we pick up first the Egyptians, and then later in the early 3000s, some of the civilizations in the Mesopotamian Valley that provide us writing. Now, the reason, as we saw last time, is because writing provides the foundation for us to know what we can know. Certainly through anthropology and even in post-Bronze Age. So moving forward, we run into civilizations in which there's no written language. And so all we have are artifacts such as pottery, weapons, tools, buildings in some cases, and maybe something like the cave drawings that are very famous, in which we know a human did that work. But we can't really draw more from that. It's not to say it's not valuable, and let's say there's nothing wrong with trying to conceptualize, well, what could they have done? But what we as historians want to do is we're building the narrative based on what we do know, based on the artifacts that we have. So where we left off last time was understanding the fact that there is knowledge that we can glean about modern society based on what we can see from antiquity. And so I kind of wanted to start there with this, because as we look at what we say civilization, so this course this is really day one material that I offer my students in our early EUH 2000. It's our ancient and medieval Western civilization class. We always start right here because many times there's confusion or there's uncertainty as what we mean by civilization. Our other course is the history of the United States. We could teach a history of Europe, or we could teach a history of England, and it'd be very clear what you're talking about. When you say Western civilization, it can feel kind of vague. Like, well, what exactly does that mean? And so we kind of want to start with an understanding of civilization. Because when we get this broad concept, it allows us then to kind of glean some lessons. And so this night, we're going to look at what lessons can we draw, particularly from antiquity, that will help us understand the human species, is the way I like to say it. We are part of the biological species world, that can then provide us insight into our own day, not in a narrow way, but in a broad way. We can say, oh, these are truisms about the species that have been true for the totality of the 5,500, 6,000 years. It doesn't mean it can't change, it could change, but currently we would be able to say with some, certainty, it has not changed to this point. So when we say civilization, what we're talking about is a group of humans who live in a specific geographic area. So that first part's really important, that they live in a specific geographic area. So when you say Western civilization, now obviously West is and East both are kind of from a frame of reference because everything's to the east of where you are and everything can be to the west of where you are. But broadly speaking, that is European Mediterranean world when we say Western civilization. But note, we start actually in the Middle East is where when we start our course, because we start with the Egyptians and the people of the Mesopotamian Valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates. When you go beyond the specific geographic area, what you look for is that there are common objective elements that you kind of can add in to a certain people group. Language being one of the key ones. And now, it doesn't have to be a language. Obviously, if you say Western civilization and you say, well, I mean Europe or European, well, then one could say, well, you've got Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and English and German and Danish. And so certainly there's different languages that can be added in a broader scope, which I'm about to show you more in a second. But specifically when we look and narrow it in, we are thinking about a language, that they have a common history, a common sense of a story narrative that is their own. Typically, as we'll see in a moment, they have a common religion or a common sense of how they understand the world that's beyond their senses, you could almost say. The idea of there being something beyond the natural. Similar customs. Now, many peoples, as we will see, even across the planet, will seemingly have very similar customs at a broad level. But when you narrow it down, you can begin to find different customs that emerge between people groups. And that, again, begins to be something that kind of helps us understand a certain people or a certain civilization separate from another. And then finally, institutions. Oftentimes, again, at a broad level, we might say, well, they have religious institutions, right? Or they have governance. And you say, well, they all have that, which they typically do. But when you narrow it on in, you can begin to find uniqueness that begins to help you separate this people group and their institutions from this other people group and their institutions. So that allows us to see some kind of difference between the civilizations. Now, when you think about this, you can think about it in a kind of ethnic way, or as I said, more typically a geographic region. So typically when you see this, you'll see a name assigned to the civilization, as you can see here in the list, in which you recognize that's a place, right? So Egypt, or Chinese civilization, or Mycenaean civilization, or Phoenician Carthaginian civilization, if you get closer to the 300-400 BC time period. Or what you can find at a more broader situation is you get kind of a general description that kind of spans the geography, right? So Hellenistic, meaning after Alexander the Great's conquest of the Middle East and his journey all the way to India, there's a moment in time for maybe roughly 100, 150 years in which we describe the civilization kind of spanning from the Adriatic, right? So on the lower Italian boot, which was settled mostly by Greek peoples, all the way across to Tibet, to modern Tibet, to India, through all of the Middle East, all through that lower part heading down towards India, not including the subcontinent, and then through the Egyptian part of North Africa, not the part closest to Spain. You would say that's a Hellenistic civilization. Later, you might say, or we might look at the broader, we would call Far East, but the Asian peoples, right? So China, Mongolia, modern day Vietnam, Thailand, Japan, Philippines, Korea. We would say, well, that's an Asian civilization. Clearly, that is a good example. You would recognize that there are differences when you narrowed it down, say between a Korean civilization and a Malaysian civilization or Tibetan, right? So there's going to be difference if you kind of narrow on in there. These civilizations, again, allow us the ability to compare and kind of observe through the various kind of aspects, lessons that can be learned. And again, the way I've described it, and I may show a picture of this in a little bit, is that there's a sense in which there's a foundation being built for the world as we find it today. So what are some of these lessons? Well, one of the first things to walk away from, and I want to try to prove this to you, you don't have to believe me just on the face of it, is that when you look at people today, and if you know your history, one of the things that you can glean is that people have not really changed all that much. Now, certainly there has been some changes. We don't, when we're punishing people through the judicial or the to police, basically, there's no one being racked. There's no one being drawn and quartered. So you can see that if there had ever been, I don't know if everybody ever voted on, hey, let's have this type of a punishment, like burning somebody at the stake, but they did it. And now we don't do it, thankfully. And so there are places where you can see, but at the kind of broader sense of considering people, right? That there were always people who were jealous of others, as an example. There were always people who were nicer than others, people who were other-centric in their thoughts and actions. And again, we're talking about spanning the entire globe and looking at all the varied civilizations. We're not just trying to look at just one civilization. And by doing this, it allows us to kind of see kind of these aspects. One of the things then secondarily that we can see is that life in the civilization is remarkably similar to our own, right? It's remarkably similar as we consider kind of how things happen. Now, again, we're not talking about the specifics of did they have TV or not. We're talking about their interactions as a species. And so these two things, that there hasn't been a lot of change and the life is very similar, lets us understand some various aspects. So to start of one that I think is really important is that the root of civilization in all the civilizations is the family unit. And that is, initially at least, father, mother, children. Now, certainly later, you'll find in times where one or the other passes, and so there may be a male who we end up finding out had 2 or 3 wives throughout their life. There are situations where the male is killed in warfare, so the mother is a widow. Many old legal texts as well as religious texts talk a lot about taking care of widows, caring for them. So there are moments when there can be what we would call a single parent. But in general terms, what we see is that the root of civilization, the kind of the idea of a family or of a society, is familial. And in fact, I would suggest that all of our societies, when you dig all the way back, they end up starting from a family. Now, so most famously, if you know your Bible, is the idea of the Hebrew people coming from Abraham and Sarah. But that same storyline can be taken literally to every people group. When we think of tribal peoples, we see this more as opposed to modern societies, because we can't think in a modern society of 200 million or 50 million people that they're all related. But ultimately, if you go back far enough within a certain people group, and there's certainly within DNA testing, we see this a lot, you're able to kind of glean that there is a connection. For the further back you go, the tighter it comes back into a family. These families, in many cases, had a balanced work scenario. Now, this kind of can tiptoe into, for many, whether or not society was patriarchal, or whether it's why women feel as if they are maligned today, or are not allowed, or held back, or have a ceiling. And you still today hear a lot of opportunities where someone will be the first or the second woman to do X, Y, or Z, which would suggest, again, my first point, society has not changed all that much, although, again, it does make some changes. But when you look at these old societies, there wasn't a sense in which the women felt kept away. It was that they had a very clear role that they were very happy to perform. I mean, Rome in particular, you see this, where a good way to describe it is that the father played the role of the CEO, but the wife played the role of the CFO. She was the chief financial operator. She was the one who made most of the legal arrangements. Most of the buying and selling would come through the wife. If you want to use a political context, the father was the king, but the wife was the prime minister. Now, that's not the way it was in every society. In some societies, the women absolutely were really only there to have the babies, care for the babies, and stay out of the way, which denied them opportunities. Other societies like Sparta absolutely provided kind of a sense of an equality for women. There are some societies in which the women were really running the show, kind of a matriarchal society, but those are few and far between. Secondly, every society that we run into, every civilization, believed in some powerful other forces at work in the world. And we loosely lump these into religion. And this will be our topic for next week, as we'll look completely at what's the story behind religion. Like, why is there religion? This was, again, one of the things that was specifically asked by some of the residents at Westminster for us to look at, right? But we can just broadly step back and we can say that every civilization on the planet believed that there was something else in charge or interacting with the humans. There's various levels as to how much the spiritual or the other forces, to use the term I've got here, controlled things, versus, like in the Greek world, they don't control things, but they interact through things. So there's a role to play. It's important for, a person in the Greek communities to honor the gods or to honor the specific god for your specific place, but to know that there's still a lot for the human to do independently or sort of on their own, or sometimes even at odds against the gods. This is really important, though, for us, because when you think one of the big things people talk about in our society today, or just broadly say the past 250 years, is the idea of separation of church and state, which is something that we'll see in a moment is brought to us actually by the Christian community. They're the ones who basically suggested that kind of in our world, starting in, say, roughly, well, it depends on when you want to look at it, but we'll say through the Middle Ages, it begins to kind of be discussed, and certainly by the 15 and 1600s. It's a unique idea, though, meaning when you consider all the other civilizations, nobody really thought that was wise. In fact, they would think it was unwise, because in their mind, there would be a natural assumption that the other forces, at least at some level, need to be consulted and incorporated into the decision making. Why would you not want to know what your spiritual gods, if you want to use that term, would think about the choice the nation or group we're about to embark on? So that's an interesting one for us to look at and think that that is a place where you say some things have changed. And maybe that's something that then we would question if we were kind of observing or measuring our own society. Is it wise, right, for us to be separated? Probably is, but when you look at the majority of people's not being so, it should certainly raise a question in our minds. Thirdly, I should have numbered these so I could have them. There's about 15 or 20 we're going to try to make our way through. There's always been this idea of the human in a wrestling match between what we've discussed multiple times here in our sessions at Valencia, Westminster, considering how Thomas Hobbes and John Locke kind of describe the human. And we've gone into that multiple times, so I won't take up time here, but just understand that that was not a new, when they wrote this in the 1600s, that was not a new idea. It was just newly being proclamated. In other words, they were looking back through history when they wrote to contemplate, what do we see? And again, what you can see, according to Hobbes, is that the human is mostly self-centered. Locke, the human is not always so self-centered. And so there's a balance, right? And that idea, I think sometimes when we look at events that happen in our world today, whether on a local level, one person does something harmful to a person, or on a larger level, right, a political leader doing something that a majority people believe is bad, we should never say, why would they do that? We should say that's the natural for us. Unfortunately, there are good people who pursue well-being for others, and then there are others who are not so good. When you look at civilizations, one of the things that we can see is that there's always a constant pull, almost like a magnetic pull or a pendulum swinging between what is the best civic structure, and it's between the very large and the very small. So some of the examples where you see the pendulum moving to the very large would be some of these here: the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire. I mentioned Alexander earlier, though his was very short-lived. At moments in time, when you consider the history of the world, you see large-scale empires in North and South America, right? The Aztec Empire, the Incan empires. These are two examples of where you have large swaths of land and typically multiple people groups being conquered and or controlled by one dominant power. And so this can sometimes go for 300, 400, 500 years, other times not quite as long. The very small are almost always the idea of what we would consider a nation. So a place unto itself making decision by itself. in a place geographically very small. That's why you always see the phrase city-state, and that's the way to put it. But I think it's always misleading because some people think, I think when they hear that, they kind of go, nation is here and city-state is here. Like, it's not really a nation. And that's an inaccurate way to look at it. So for instance, the Athenians were a nation to themselves. They never considered themselves Greek in the sense that we Greeks are kind of somehow working together, like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio. We work together to make something in a place called the United States. No, to the Athenians, to the Spartans, to the Corinthians, to the Thebians, to the many other city-states that were around. Rome, when it first started out, the Mesopotamian Valley city-states, they were independent to themselves and operating. Now, what's really interesting is considering at some moments when you consider the history of the world, the pendulum moves completely over to one side. So for instance, at the time of the Persian Empire, and then later the Roman Empire, at least in their geographical spectrum, there was no other player. It was just them. They were the completely dominant place. And then the spectrum will swing the other direction. So there are times when all there is the small. Sometimes it's balanced, right? So there's some large-scale empires while there are also some small city-states. I think when you look at the United States, I think that's one of the things that's happening to us, and maybe has been for maybe 50 years, is a feeling or a tension about how we decide what's best for us as a people. And I think this has really grown as our numbers have grown, right? So now we're 330, 340 million people, living in North America, in the United States. And that's obviously massively, massively larger than even 50 years ago, right? So there's a sense of, can the structure that we have work well? Nobody, I think, says it openly, like from the podium of a governor's house or a mayor's house, but I think that in the back of their minds, that's what's happening there. All right, our next lesson is that there is a constant pull between settled and nomadic. Now, certainly today, there's very few nomadic peoples. They are still there. There are still places on the globe where there are nomadic peoples. In other words, they're not settled in cities. You go back though to Antiquity, you clearly see certain places, certain people groups that are settled, and other people groups who are not settled. They don't have a home base. They just constantly are on the move. And this is true even when you look in North America, for instance, or most famously with our Native American peoples, even into the 1800s, you have moving tribal peoples in North America. Certainly in Africa into the 1900s, same thing. And in certain spots in Asia and even on some Pacific islands, which seems kind of small, but nonetheless, because it's an island, it's almost isolated to itself, a moving people group. When you look at leadership, we saw this last time when I talked at the end in December, we were discussing this, but I just wanted to go over it again and kind of these attributes from Antiquity. What can we learn? Leadership is always the power pyramid that I showed you before. And here it is again, just that same slide that we looked at and we talked about it back in December. There is no other example that I am aware of where you can see this. Even in, so there could be some civilizations that are still at the tribal level in which familial is the key. So in other words, there can be one people group living somewhere, and let's just say, for instance, there are 5 family groupings in that people, right? And so typically, and often in those settings, at the top of the pyramid would be the leaders of all 5 groups, right? And so they would be operating like a group. And if there were 7 families or 8 families, there would be those people at the top, right? But if you back that up, you would say, wait, well, who's at the top of the families? Again, power pyramid. One single person with centralized control, a minority people, meaning a small number of people, is kind of a secondary group. If you think in the Middle Ages, you might think the nobility, right? So there's a king or a person at the top, but then underneath that, there's the knights and the dukes and the earls and the margraves, and they have a little bit of more of an influence to the leadership. And then there's everybody else. It's almost always the 75 to 80% who are not at the top. And as I described to you last time, from my reading of our historical story, there are 4 the rich man, the strong man, the holy man, or the wise man. And almost always there may be a combination between the rich man and the holy man, the rich man and the strong man, the rich man and the wise man, or sometimes the strong man with the holy man, or the strong man. Who's the leader? That guy. Well, who is that guy? Well, he's the guy who's led us in all of our wars, and nobody really can threaten his leadership because he'll kill them. So that's what I'm talking about. You rarely see the holy man or the wise man independently at the top. And again, I'm just giving generalized descriptions, but when you go and you start looking and scanning all the societies, this is what you see, the power pyramid. And of course, the point we made in December was the fact that you rarely see any place that even remotely tries to incorporate the larger group of people at the bottom in some way with the rest of the tribal leadership. So I think that's a really key point to kind of bring out, not to suggest something about our modern day, but I guess I'm not surprised when we as people are attracted to leaders who we like and wish to give them maybe more power than is good for us. And I think that that's sometimes there are obviously in our modern age dictators that we can look at and say they took power and then brutally kept power. But in most cases, what we find is a person who gains the leadership through one mechanism or another, but not through brutal force. They may stay in power through brutal force. They typically do. Stalin's one of the worst examples of that. However, they're also largely loved in a way that doesn't match the metaphor when we think of dictatorial power. And the why would go back to this, is that I think there's something about the human that actually likes it. Maybe there's something Freud might suggest that they're looking for a father figure, but that's the story. In every society, still going through the lessons, these are independent, there's always rich people. So when you hear people complaining about the wealthy today, or that it's unfair they have so much wealth, I would actually agree with that. At the same time, it is not an aberration in our historical story. In fact, it's the way there always is. Jesus, of course, said this most famously, you'll always have the poor with you, is what he said. And he was one of the poor. He didn't have a house, didn't really have any possessions. So he would know. But this is always a truism for a people group, and ought to make some suggestion to what we can do to solve the problem and or accommodate the problem. Not surprisingly, those with wealth like to keep it. And typically we see them passing this down generationally. So this is where you get the idea of generational poverty. That's a real thing, I believe, in which some peoples, many peoples who are on that lower spectrum can ultimately get stuck and becomes very difficult for them to rise out of it. It can happen in mobile societies. So the United States is typically be considered a mobile society where somebody from a poor background. So my grandfather was a sharecropper. He had 12 children. My dad was the 12th one. All of them, I think all of them, most of them went to college. All of them moved up from, say, if we think of a sharecropper as being, say, low economic class, right? Sharecropper, right? Then they all moved to middle class. Now, my wife and my sister, my wife and I, and my sister and her husband are also still middle class. We haven't raised above that. We stayed in education. So there you go, right? And I was a pastor. So, kind of realize, you're not trying to make a lot of money in the process. But you see generationally, you can move up, but it's not easy to do. And we shouldn't be surprised, as a larger point, that the rich are not going to give away their wealth. We often hear in our current day a suggestion that maybe some rich people would be happy for higher taxes. But funny, you never see them taking their checkbook out and just writing the check that they could easily give. If they want the government to take millions more in taxes, they could just give it if they wanted to, but they don't. I'm not saying that they should necessarily. I'm just saying it matches what we learn, right, through the process. One of the things you can see when you study history is how easy it is for the members of a society, so the citizens in some categories and some civilizations, to be manipulated. This was why James Madison from our country, was so famous about suggesting that you didn't want to be in a democracy, that a republic in his mind would be better. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a whole different conversation, which we've actually delved into here before. But the point being, if we feel like today we're confronted with fake news, and as I heard President Obama say on 60 Minutes back in December, we seem to be operating in a time of post-fact. And he was concerned about it, which rightfully so, to be concerned about operating in a world that doesn't seem to know or understand what facts are. But the idea that people are manipulated is not new. It's not something to do with the computer or social media. That may have exacerbated it, but it didn't create it. And there's multiple examples. Again, when I see these examples, I'm talking about across all the continents, all the peoples, all the ethnicities, all the places you can look where a people group did these things. And so in this case, right, so all the rich people, the power pyramid, the people not being allowed to vote, I mean, all the different things that I'm mentioning here, the idea of religion, all in all the people groups, all the civilizations that we can draw. And so this is one also. And so it is very easy for the people to be misled through information. This becomes really important. Again, there's few attempts, I said this earlier, but to repeat it, there's very few attempts. Athens and Rome are most famous. They're not alone. There are a few other places where you could suggest that there was more of an involvement of more of the people, right? So it wasn't just the power pyramid, but these are so isolated. You literally can put them on, two hands. In some of the examples, if you like Google it or go to Britannica, some of the examples that they list are really a stretch. Now, you obviously find more after 1776. So we did it, and then by succeedingly surviving, say by 1876, through a civil war, you begin to find more and more places in the past century saying, hey, let's try this at different levels. And of course, that's a different conversation. All of the societies develop rules for behavior, and typically we call these laws. Not every place calls them laws, but generally we can use that term. And so you can compare these, you can look. Some of these we have very clearly written down for us, Hammurabi's code being an example. We have some from the Egyptians, very clear from the Hittites, from the Greeks, from the Athenians, from the Romans, from the Hebrews. Other places it's more of kind of can draw conclusions from other things that you can read. But they have these laws that are written for us. And the writing of law is a really important concept for us. They're developed, though, by commonalities. And then this is really important back to when you're looking at our own society. What's the struggle, right, in our own society? Perhaps the struggle in the United States more than any other is that at least over the past, and again, I would say maybe 50 years, perhaps only 30 years, you can begin to draw a question and wonder, has the people who live, are the people who live in North America no longer operating off a common set of values? Now, let's not make that a good or bad thing. Let's just say, is it a thing, right? If there is a place, the United States, or any other place, right? So Nigeria or Chile, or, long continent on the South American continent, long country on the South American continent. If that people living there no longer have a common set of values, then it becomes impossible, at least historically speaking, for there to be common rules by which everyone obeys. So this is a really important concept, and you go back to thinking about that pendulum swinging, or really the collapse of societies, which I'm about to show you another one of the lessons here that we kind of can glean from Antiquity, is that maybe what's going on is the people no longer see themselves as a whole thing. So go back to my early slide, what's a civilization? I wasn't saying what is a nation, but you can to some degree sort of begin to slide over to there and say, well, what does it take for a people to be coherent, right? To cohere as a group, right? And otherwise you kind of move away from that. One of the things that's really fascinating to watch throughout history is the places where you see the law written and thus very clearly known because it's articulated. So like Hammurabi, I should have had my picture for you. He made these massive 7-8 foot high stone statues that were placed throughout the empire that had all the laws written on them. And you can see this in like the British Museum has one, and you can see it, the Louvre has one, and it's fascinating to look at the law. So it's very clearly written down. John Adams talked about what he believed a functioning republic would be, is that it was based on a set of laws, and the laws would be consistent for everyone. This is something that's being debated right now, and to some degree has been for the past 30 to 50 years, although in the 19th century, certainly there are people in America who were arguing that it wasn't true for Rockefeller, it wasn't true for a president, but that the laws should be known. But when they're not written down, and so there's times when you can really see that, certainly after the fall of the Roman Empire, for at least 200 or 300 years, you really have this period where there's just no real clear rules written down. In England, you could arguably say there's no written law until you get to the Magna Carta in the 1200s, and that's not really a written law. So when there's no laws written down, what can happen? Obviously, the rich and the powerful are able to kind of manipulate things to their benefit in a way that those who are not powerful cannot do that. We see that in our own day, different framework where it seems as if, if you were trying to be sued by somebody rich, or if you got into an issue with some rich company, then they could lawyer up, is the phrase, right? They could afford to go into court and extend the court proceedings through all kinds of mechanisms in a way that an average person could not do. So therefore they could win by manipulating the law. This is one of the things that concerns us with our own time. Interestingly, and then this begins to raise other questions about going back before the written history, is most of the societies, or there are common laws found in various civilizations and locations. Murder is a good example. In other words, it wasn't like decided in the 1950s that murder should be bad, and therefore there needs to be a law in every country. The idea of not taking someone else's life, or that there are penalties for this, seems to exist from the beginning. So that raises a lot of wonderful questions that the anthropologists get to confront, but not really ever answer, although certain religious groups would provide an answer for it. I just find these fascinating. I'll have students go through a period where they will read some of the ancient law codes, and I'll have them compare and contrast them, right, to kind of look and see where's their similarity, where's their difference. And they will see many similarities between these law codes. So it raises some interesting and useful questions, but it also, I think, is telling about the human species. Again, as we're trying to understand, who is this species? Who is this people group? And so there's some things that we hold value, that should not happen or should be punished if they do happen. War and conflict very consistently throughout human history. As far as I am aware, there's no setting by which we can find where multiple people groups were unwilling to go to war. Certainly there are pacifist groups. So when we did the Reformation study last year, I introduced you to the Anabaptists, who initially were not pacifist, but had become pacifist after their disaster through the battles around the city of Munster. And so they become pacifist. And you could say there's this people group who will not go to war. In other words, the typical pacifist, if you hit them, they will not hit you back, kind of a thing. Or what we would hope a Christian would do, they turn the other cheek, that kind of a story. But you don't really see that in any nation. Switzerland very famously has been independent or neutral and has not been drawn into war. And yet you hear stories, particularly with the French, of the Swiss Guard being places and fighting in wars. So Swiss people, certainly, some Swiss people did not have a problem going to war. There's just no place where you see this happening. Again, famously with Woodrow Wilson, there hoped to be, many people hypothesized, that a democratic world would be a world without war. And 121 years later, after the Treaty of Versailles, 102 years later, after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, clearly that is not true. Now, maybe if we keep pressing and learning, maybe 100 years later, that will be true. There'll be no more wars because people will be allowed to really control the operating structure of their society. We'll have to wait and see. The why for war, I think Hobbes really nails it. So he goes into depth in trying to explain when he says that the natural state of human is nasty and brute, BRT, like a brute, brutish and short, and is basically a stage of warfare between peoples. He lays out three reasons, which we've covered before, but I think it's useful when you think about what can we glean about societies. And one is that there's competition. And so he suggests that there are two individuals who want the same thing. They want the same promotion. If we think to Black Friday as a silly example, they want the one TV that's there in the Target. There's only two people who want the one TV. There's competition. Who's going to get there first? Who's going to buy it? That kind of a thing. there's the need for safety, right? So this is typically, I perceive you as a threat. And so because I perceive you as a threat, I attack you. Now, physically attack, yes, you can see that in some situations, but think of it more in terms of workplace environments or neighborhoods. So I'm afraid somebody's going to bother me, so I get the HOA group kind of involved, or I begin engaging in a kind of an operation to malign and down talk my opponent in the workplace, so that the boss sees that person in a worse scenario, and I bring the people and I get an alliance of those who agree with me, and I stir that pot, right? Why do I do that? Because maybe I perceive that person as a threat. And then thirdly, kind of the pursuit of glory, right? Just, I want to be for me, and I want everybody to see me. And so, you step on whoever you got to step on to make that happen, kind of a thing. And when you read Hobbes, I think there is a sense in which somebody goes, wow, that's not cool. I don't like that, because we have been informed, particularly in the West, from a Christian worldview of what we should be as good people. But when you kind of back away from the Christian story and you just say, look at the people at large, and you take these three ideas and spread it out to groupings, right? That's almost always why wars are occurring, and why I don't think that we'll find a time where there will not be that conflict between peoples, particularly when you add in how easy it is to manipulate the people, right? So the leadership with all the information, being able to manipulate people in a way that we might say, that's terrible, nobody should do that, I wish there was a way to stop it. I agree, I wish there was a way to stop it. 5,500 years later, there hasn't been a way to stop it. Another lesson that we can see is that some societies become very powerful, very wealthy. If you've never read Jared Diamond, he actually has a trilogy that he's done on societies, but this was the first one that he wrote, I believe in the early 2000s, might have been the late 90s, but I'm pretty sure it's early 2000s, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He has a hypothesis as to why the West is the dominant power, because, as I've said before, the world we live in today is a Western world. It's based on Western concepts of Western civilization, which I'm about to hopefully show you some in a second. We'll see if we get there or not. Others dispute both that idea, though that's hard to dispute, or Diamond's hypothesis, which there's some things that can be suggested. Largely put, though, regardless of the why, what we can see when you study society, so just study Africa alone, or I mentioned the Incas, so just study South America alone. Why did the Inca peoples become the dominant power? Right? And there's reasons, right? There's unique reasons. And what you want to see, though, is that it did happen. It's not as if it didn't happen, or it only happened with Rome. It's not that it just happened with Rome. It's that it happens all the time. Currently, the United States is the dominant, most wealthy, most powerful country, but it's being challenged, particularly by China. And one of the problems for the Europeans with Brexit is that they've spent the last, 60 years trying to recreate, if not the Roman Empire, then the Holy Roman Empire. Why? So that Europe as a thing could compete or dominate the world, opposed to the United States or opposed to China. In fact, I listen to some news from Germany and from France almost every day, English speaking, and there was basically a conversation about what's happening in China and the most recent China European trade agreement that's occurred in the past week or so. If you Google it, you'll find it. And this person was suggesting that it wasn't so much that there was China dominating, but that Europe, he was saying, this is a leader of the European Chamber of Commerce, was saying that Europe is trying to find a way to balance itself between these two. In other words, in European minds, they're equal. Well, the point of all that is just to say civilization has become very wealthy and powerful. However, everyone has fallen either completely away, right? So there's no more Persian Empire, there's no more Alexandrian Empire, there's no more Mongolian Empire, or fallen away into reduced influence. So for about 150 years, France was the dominant power in Europe. France is still around. They've been around for a long time. They're a very prideful and powerful country, but their influence is not as high. England's in the same spot. Rome disappeared completely to be reborn 1,300 years later, 1,400 years later in the 1870s as Italy, with Rome at the center of it, but no longer the Roman Empire. Mussolini was attempting in his own mind to recreate the Roman Empire. The Egyptians are one of the few places that has been around the whole journey, right? The whole run. We start with the Egyptian peoples in the 35 or so 100 BC. They're still with us today. But with the empire that they had, they lost at the time of Alexander. So you always see this happening. Why does it happen? It is almost always due to internal influences. Certainly, there are external influences. So I just mentioned Egypt and I mentioned Alexander, right? So the Egyptians, we would not say conquered, although I think that's more fair, is that Alexander conquered. In the Egyptian minds, and certainly in Alexander's mind, he was a liberator, liberating the Egyptians from whom? Well, from some other forces that had dominated them in the period of time from, say, roughly 500 BC to 300 BC. So mostly Mesopotamian people groups, Persians in particular by that point. So the Egyptians had ceased to be a dominant power, but it wasn't just that they had lost some wars, or the Romans, or the French, who I mentioned earlier, or the Mongolians. It's that all these people groups become very powerful. And to some degree, I would suggest they become addicted to their luxury. When you follow the history of all these people groups, there is kind of a desperate early sense of achievement. To some degree, you can think of it almost like a business. So one of you may have, or your child may have, or you know somebody who's starting their own business now. And what do you hear about people who start their own business? They're hustling, they've got to go hard. They may work 60, 70 hours. Sometimes divorces happen. Sometimes children feel like they're abandoned, but the person is just digging in because they're going hard, right? And imagine that happening over a life. They begin to become successful. They make it. Their child, though, knows how hard they've worked. Maybe they're able to turn their business over to their child. Child number two, typically now they're not really fighting to stay alive. They're fighting to expand, right? But child number three and child number four are typically born into the lap of luxury. There's no contest for them. They just have everything. They're rich, they're powerful. Their father or their grandfather or their great-grandfather's business has been successful. And you see this with nations. And so when you're looking for a fall of an empire, hint, 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 our own country perhaps, one of the things that's most obvious is when you see people losing their way connected to the idea of just having to put diligent effort into the work, right? So there's a lot more we could say there. We don't want to get sidetracked. We're running out of time. We'll kind of get through this. One of the last things to say, which is the saddest, but again, we're looking at these lessons. And that is, slavery is a constant throughout history. And tragically, I've said this before, but I want to say it again for the record, this is being recorded, right? We have slavery with us today, unfortunately. And hopefully you who are listening, you will make it your practice to do everything in your power to do nothing to afford slavery an opportunity to continue. But we have it in this country. Sadly, it exists in this city. It's just that it's not obvious. It's not out in the open anymore. So that we have slavery now should not surprise anybody who knows their history, because we've always had slavery. I think this has a lot to do with wealth, has a lot to do with power, has a lot to do with contests between people groups. It's something we shouldn't be satisfied with. If there's one place I would love to wave a magic wand and change an aspect of our human society, it'd be this, that no human ever wanted to own or use to power to their advantage to, in essence, own another human. But it does happen. I think that's the last one, right? I want to do this. I think we can do this. Just when you look at Western civilization, I think there's some things to take away from here, but I may save this. Let me go ahead and show it to you. In the end, when we look at the world we find today is controlled by the West. This was not always the case, as I'm trying to show you with these numbers. When you go back and you look and you get into the 1700s, early 1800s, and you were putting, say, Africa and South America, North America, Europe, or if you thought of people groups, so some of the larger tribal peoples in Africa, some of the people groups in the Middle East, the Ottomans, people in the Asian areas, and you put them on a graph, and you just thought of like wealth or power, and you graphed them. Everybody was pretty equal until you get into the 1800s, and England begins nosing ahead, and then hot on their heels are us. And by the time you get to early 1900, the West in particular, England and her children, so Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, all had shot up far, far, far on a graph Jeffrey Sachs, S-A-C-H-S, did a wonderful book called The End of Poverty, in which he has some wonderful graphs. I should have put them in here. Depicts this. So we're not trying to say that it's good or bad. I actually would say it's good, that the Western ideas and values and concepts are useful, right? And so there's things that we can apply in there. But whether it's good or useful, as I tell my students, it's important to understand that that is the case so you can understand the world. So things that we're saying that matter to us, such as rights or human rights or voting rights, the ability for a woman to have free opportunity, the ability for any person in a given place to pursue whatever job they want. All those are Western concepts. They do not exist in other civilizations prior to the West imposing these ideas. So it's useful for us to kind of understand that. And if the world can be understood as a house, you know, when you're born into the house, you didn't have anything to do with it. It just was here when you were born. When you become an adult, if you want to add a room on, you want to repaint it, you want to tear it down and build another house, you can do that. But when you're born into it. And when we're born into the world today, we're born into the Western world. That's the house. I suggest to my students, that's really what's being built from really the Renaissance to now. So modernity, we could say. But what's the foundation? And that foundation comes to us from antiquity. And when you look at the foundation of the West through antiquity, three things jump out. And I'll run through these quickly, and then we're almost done. From the Greek, the idea of the value of the mind. From the Romans, the idea of civilization based on written law, so like constitution. And from the Christians, the value of all peoples, regardless of wealth or power. Right? Now, again, I'm not saying, and I wouldn't say that there were no other people groups who thought philosophically or about the mind. And we already discussed how there were several people groups that had law. And certainly in every civilization, there were some people who valued other people, particularly those of no power. But when you look at society, what you recognize is these three people groups or civilizations contributed to Western civilization at a kind of a grouped level in a way that nobody else did. Let's go a little deeper. I love this quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who is a mathematician and a philosopher from England. I believe he's still alive. But anyway, the safest general characteristic of European philosophical thought is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Meaning, no matter who you're looking at, Descartes, Nietzsche, in the Middle Ages, some of the thinkers of that time, Occam, back to some of the early Roman thinkers, they're all basically standing on Plato. The Greeks alone emphasized a philosophy of the mind in a way that was unique in the world. Again, there were other people thinking religiously and thinking spiritually and thinking about the understanding of the human, but the Greeks, and you know, of course, the great triumvirate of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but many others, particularly in Athens, had this focus. It was a unique thing, and it basically provided us a nutshell, this idea that there is an awareness that one can glean even about oneself, that you can become aware of self. No other people groups really talked about that, not like the Greeks did. For the Romans provide, and to this day, what we look at in the West and now spread throughout the world, the idea of judges, the idea of constitutions, the idea of certain kinds of laws, of common law, all that goes back to the Romans, particularly the concept of the citizen having a voice. Remember, the Athenians only did their democracy in little tiny Athens. The Romans were doing the republic, which by the time it fell was the entire peninsula, almost, you'd say basically all of the Western Mediterranean was under this idea of the republic, and questions arose about who was a citizen. But then that kind of is an implanted idea that the Romans provided for us, which is very beneficial. This idea of a constitution, it's not really fair, I think, to say the Romans sat down in a room somewhere and wrote a constitution. But when you get the law of the 12 tables constructed by around the 200s, as we talked about back in December, you can see that there is a version of a constitution by which the people understood they knew. You get this story really, really well when you look at, say, the great Christian evangelist, Paul, who was a Roman citizen by birth. And he's arrested in one of his many escapades that are described in Dr. Luke's second volume, The Acts of the Apostles. And he's being punished by the authorities, which is their right to do. And he's about to be whipped, basically. And it's interesting, Paul waits. It's almost like he's planning this, like a legal defense lawyer might, Perry Mason might jump out at the last minute with a fact. Aha. I mean, he's like, is this how you treat a Roman citizen? And the guy's like, whoa, wait a minute, what? Because if he had beaten Paul without a trial, he himself could be executed, because you couldn't beat a Roman citizen without a jury trial. So then the guy in charge is like, he goes, gets his leader, hey, this guy's a citizen. That dude freaks out. He's like, whoa, wait a minute, you're a citizen? Did you buy your citizenship? And Paul's like, nope, I was born into it. So then the judge is like, whoa, let him out, let him go. And Paul's like, no, I want my trial. And so this is a key moment for the Christians and Paul going to Rome. But the point is, that's all around the Roman world. That same story could not have held true in most of the other civilizations around the world. And speaking of the Christians, certainly for the last 2,000 years, the Christians are the dominant feature and cultural value of the West. I was watching a comedian who I don't think is a Christian at all, but he was making this really funny joke about, hey, the Christians won. And his joke was, that because of how we count the years. 2021 is an artifact of Christianity, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. It's imposed on us because I've already told you, we're really at, year 5,700 or so, depending on which people group you talk to, who really keeps the reckoning. The Hebrews, the Chinese, being two examples of people who kind of have a dating system. But the year is not the important part. And certainly Christianity has its own issues to deal with from its history, which we could go into depth if we wanted to. And I'm open for that if you want to. But the Christians, the value for them is this, that they add to Western civilization. When you think about some of our battles today about rights, about voting, particularly for women, or for people who are considered minority groups, particularly out of the West. So we look at Iran, hey, let your women drive. Or you look in Asia, hey, let a family have more than one kid. What are we saying? We're imposing Western ideas. And when you start talking about the marginalized, the outcasts, the poor, no people group on the planet cared about those people. And as we said earlier, there's been poor everywhere, right? There's always poor and always the outsider. That's just normative to the idea of our human society. The Christians come along and say, hey, we're going to love all those people. Now, did they do it perfectly once Constantine happened? No, but that doesn't change the fact that that was their foundational giving to the Western society. They even included women as leaders right up until the time you get to Constantine. Again, there's more to go into with Christianity, but again, these are really, really critical points. These three, the Greeks with the mind, the Romans with the law, the Christians with the care of the human and the almost idea of human rights, becomes this foundational piece for Western civilization, which is what we now then look ahead. There's your takeaway from Antiquity. Now, next time we're going to, because again, somebody asked 2 years ago now, 3 years, we're going to dig deeper into religion. We'll keep it general. We're going to try to understand what is it about religion that was attractive to people, that then drew them, and then what were some of the variations that we can see. And again, we won't go deep. I'm not going to claim to be an expert of some of the different religious groups, but we're going to kind of look at some of the pieces that are out there in our third part of the series. I appreciate you guys being with me. I hope all of you who watch this have a wonderful week, and we will be here next Thursday. All right, so have a good evening. Thank you very much.